I'm a police officer that quit his job after a paranormal experience. I'm not a superstitious person. I didn't believe in ghosts or demons until now. Yeah, stuff happens that can't be explained. But I just want you all to know that it took more than a couple of flying spoons or a door opening on its own to scare me out of my job. Since the department didn't find any reason to keep this police report confidential, I will now detail you everything I can on what happened on the scariest night of my life. We had just received word from dispatch to check out a noise complaint in a small neighborhood whose name I will not disclose for their privacy. It was me and my partner. Let's call him Paul and I'll go by Mike. We arrived sometime after midnight. The street is dead. Everyone is sound asleep at this point. We park our patrol car in front of the aforementioned house and exit the vehicle. We knock on the door and let our presence known. Police. Is anyone home? A little girl, 8-10 in appearance, opens the door and peeks through the gap. Hey, I crouch to make myself less intimidating. Is your parent or guardian home? She shakes her head. My first thought was that she probably had the TV a little too high and woke up the neighbors. But before I could tell her to stay inside and lock the doors then part, I heard the sound of crashing silverware coming from what I presumed would be the kitchen. The entire house was nearly pitch black. The girl answering the door and shaking her head let me know she was alone, which makes whoever made that noise an intruder as far as it concerns me. I asked the girl to step outside and turned to Paul. Paul, why don't you give her one of those lollipops you like to suck on when you're nervous? Paul gave me a cold stare as the girl giggled. They went to go wait by the car as I slowly pushed the door all the way open. Police. If there is anyone in this house, please let yourself be known. Without a warrant, I had no right to enter the building. I tried my best to spot whoever made the noise, but it is too dark to see. Just any sign of a threat and I would be justified to search the house. But nothing. I left the door open and headed back towards Paul and the girl. He again. I don't think we introduced ourselves. I'm Officer Mike. This is my partner Paul. If I may ask, what is your name? Marable Ball. That's a pretty name, so Marable. Again, if I may ask, where is your family? As soon as I had finished my sentence, the television in the living room turned on, volume fully up. Me and Paul quickly turned in surprise and could see the television playing static from outside. We put Marable in the back seat of the patrol car for her safety, as no civilians were allowed in the front seats. We then, against our better judgment, enter the house. We tried every switch in the house, but no lights came on. While wandering the house cautiously, I would catch a person standing in the mirrors. I thought it was Paul, but every time I looked behind me, Paul was nowhere to be found. As I returned to the front door along with Paul, we both jumped as running footsteps echoed down the hall. We detached our firearms and aimed it at the source. The footsteps got louder and got closer, but no one ever appeared physically. Lamps, chairs, and other stuff started getting thrown around by an invisible force as the footsteps reached us. We sprinted out of the house and waited by the front yard. The footsteps seemed to stop, followed by the police siren that went off. I ran to the car and silenced the siren. I looked back at Paul, who seemed shooked. You all right, Paul? He takes a lollipop out of its package and puts it in his mouth. Yep. I opened the rear door and checked up on Marable. You okay? She nodded her head, so I walked back to Paul. I don't know what to make of this, he said. Yeah, me neither. No, seriously. Ignore the running invisible man that knocked everything down for a second. All the family photos, pictures on the wall. He points at Marable. She's not in any of them. So what are you thinking? The footsteps led outside. Then the siren goes off. There's a million buttons in that car. What are the chances? Paul, are you trying to tell me that Marable is haunted? How do you explain what we just saw? I'm sure there's an explanation now. The TV turns on when we take Marable outside. prompting us to check it out. Someone or something shows up in the mirrors but ducks away. I remember wanting to shut him up, not because he wasn't making any sense, but because he was. I know you've seen it. It was prowling around. Then it runs outside and gets in the car, tries all the buttons. I think a ghost is trying to get to the girl. I just stood there, not sure what to say, until Paul decided to start walking back towards the house. Paul, what are you doing? It only shows up in the mirrors. That's how we find it. I followed him inside and watched as he takes a book from the counter and breaks the nearest mirror. What's the matter with you? That's someone's property. He takes a shard and hands another to me. It's not every day you get to arrest a ghost. We aimed our flashlights all over the house, waiting for something to appear in the broken glass. I recall praying to God Almighty to not let anything show up, but it did. I panicked as it swung its red bunny arm at my back. It ripped right through my uniform, causing me to fall forward. I dropped the glass, which broke into smaller chunks. It continued clawing at my shirt and flesh, but stopped when Paul opened fire. I heard its screech fading as Paul helped me up. We both then hurried back outside to find Maribel missing from the back seat. It was difficult explaining what happened to the department without sounding like nutjobs. The police cameras, who we were betting on to prove our stories, had shut off the moment we entered the house. The thing, whatever it was, must have turned them off while we were unaware. The only part of our story that our police captain took seriously was the girl Maribel. The captain brought up a missing person report and asked us if this was the girl we saw. It was. It's been just a few days since I gave up the badge to save whatever little pride I could spare. I just ask to whoever reads this and to whomever it may reach. The next time a door opens on its own or things move by themselves in your home, check the mirrors. I knew there was something off about my new employer, but I didn't expect this. The first time I saw the Bluefin Diner, it was exactly the kind of place I expected to find in a wasteland like this. Route 66 stretched ahead like a ribbon of asphalt through the barren desert, the air shimmering with heat under the relentless afternoon sun. The road seemed endless, with nothing but barren land and the occasional cactus breaking the monotony. It was the kind of desolation that made you feel small, insignificant. Just another speck in the vastness of the universe. I'd been on the move for weeks, drifting from town to town, with nothing but my old duffel bag and a sense of hollowness that had settled in my chest like a stone. After losing my job and falling out with the few friends I had, it felt like there was nothing left for me anywhere. The nights were the hardest, sleepless hours spent staring at modal ceilings, wondering if I would ever find a place where I belonged. I had no family to turn to, and each new town was just another place to pass through, another attempt to escape the emptiness inside. I have no family, no friends, and no place to call home. The kind of person who could disappear without a trace, and no one would even notice. It was as if I was a ghost already, drifting aimlessly, waiting for anything to give me a reason to stay. When I pulled into the parking lot, there wasn't a soul in sight, just a faded sign hanging by a single rusty chain that read "Help Wanted," and an old gas pump out front that looked like it hadn't worked in decades. The diner itself looked like it had been forgotten by time, the paint peeling, the windows dusty and streaked. It was a relic of a bygone era, a place that seemed to exist out of sheer stubbornness. I paused for a moment, staring at the sign. Maybe this was what I needed. I had nowhere else to go, no direction, just a longing for a place to belong, even if just for a few nights. The thought of having something to do, even if it was just washing dishes or sweeping floors, was enough to make me consider it. I pushed the thought away, taking a deep breath, and made my way inside, the bell above the door chiming softly as I stepped inside. The dim interior was a mix of peeling wallpaper, cracked linoleum floors, and flickering neon lights that cast eerie shadows across the empty booths. The air was thick with the smell of grease and old coffee, a mix that clung to my senses, making my stomach turn slightly. A single man stood behind the counter, his face lined and weathered, with hollow eyes that seemed to look right through me. He was the owner, though he never bothered to tell me his name. I hesitated for a moment before making my way to a booth in the corner. I slid into the cracked vinyl seat, the material sticking to my skin as I settled in. The owner watched me, his expression unreadable, his hollow eyes following my every move as if sizing me up. After a moment, he shuffled over, a notepad in hand. "What'll it be?" he asked, his voice gruff, his tone making it clear he wasn't interested in small talk. I glanced at the faded menu lying on the table, the pages yellowed with age and stained with coffee rings. There wasn't much to choose from, and everything looked like it had been there since the place first opened. "Just a coffee, please," I replied, offering a small, tentative smile, though I doubted it would make any difference. He nodded, turning away without a word. I watched as he moved behind the counter, the sound of the coffee machine breaking the silence. It felt strange, almost surreal, sitting there in the empty diner, the hum of the old refrigerator the only other noise. The neon sign outside flickered, casting brief flashes of red and blue across the room, adding to the sense of unease that seemed to permeate the place. He returned a moment later, setting the chipped mug in front of me. I wrapped my hands around it, savoring the warmth, even if the coffee itself tasted burnt and bitter. It was something tangible, something to hold on to in the unsettling quiet of the diner. "Thanks," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He gave a curt nod, his eyes lingering on me for a moment longer before he turned away, his footsteps echoing across the empty floor as he retreated behind the counter. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me, even when his back was turned. I cleared my throat, pointing towards the sign outside. "You hiring?" I asked, my voice sounding smaller than I intended, the words barely carrying across the empty room. He looked at me for a moment, his gaze weighing on me, then nodded slowly, as if the decision wasn't really his to make, as if he was resigned to whatever fate had brought me here. "Need a job?" he asked, his voice flat and devoid of any warmth, like he had heard the same request 100 times before and knew how it would end. I nodded. The truth was, I needed money, enough to get me out of this place, to the next town, and maybe a little further. He didn't ask any questions, didn't want to know where I was from or what had brought me here. He just nodded back, a small, almost imperceptible movement of his head, like he understood more than he was letting on. "Okay, you'll start tonight," he muttered, his voice carrying a hint of something I couldn't quite place. Was it pity, or maybe just indifference? He hesitated for a moment, then gestured for me to follow him. "Let me show you around," he said, his voice still gruff, but with a hint of resignation, as if he knew that neither of us had much of a choice in the matter. I got up from the booth, the seat creaking as I stood, and followed him through the diner. He moved slowly, pointing out the essentials with a practiced efficiency, his voice a monotonous drone as he spoke. "The counter, where you'll be serving. Coffee machine, temperamental, but it works if you treat it right. Kitchen's back here," he said, pushing open the swinging door to reveal a grimy room filled with old pots and pans. His words were clipped, like he was simply going through the motions. There was a wariness to him, an exhaustion that seemed to seep into every word he spoke. He showed me the storage room, the restrooms, and even the back exit, his explanations brief and to the point. There was no warmth in his words, no attempt to make me feel at ease. Just the basics. Like he'd done this before, like he knew I wouldn't be here long. After a while, he turned back to the front, pausing by the door. "That's about it. Good luck, kid," he said, his hollow eyes meeting mine for a brief moment. There was something in his gaze, something unsaid, but before I could make sense of it, he grabbed his coat from behind the counter and walked out, the door closing with a jingle of the bell. I watched him disappear into the night, Something about the way he'd said those words making my skin prickle. There was an emptiness in the diner now, a void that seemed to expand in his absence. But I ignored it. I needed this. I needed something to keep me grounded, even if it was just for a little while. I walked around the diner, taking in the peeling wallpaper, the cracked vinyl booths, and the flickering neon lights that cast an eerie glow over everything. There was something unsettling about the place, something that felt wrong, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was just the isolation, the sense of being completely cut off from the rest of the world. I went to the kitchen in the back, a grimy little room filled with pots and pans that had seen better days. The air was thick with the scent of stale grease and something metallic, and I could hear the faint drip of water echoing from a leaking pipe. The floor creaked under my weight, and every surface seemed to carry a layer of grime that spoke of years of neglect. There was a window above the sink, looking out over the parking lot, and beyond that, a lake. It was the only thing that broke the monotony of the desert, a dark, still body of water that seemed to go on forever. I settled in behind the counter, a cup of lukewarm coffee in front of me as I tried to stay awake. The hours dragged on, the silence pressing in on me, until I heard it true a soft, haunting melody, drifting through the air. At first, I thought it might have been the wind, but as the sound grew clearer, I realized it wasn't natural. There was a rhythm to it, an eerie beauty that seemed almost deliberate. It tugged at something inside me, urging me to move, to follow. I frowned, looking around, but there was no one else in the diner. The sound seemed to be coming from outside, from the direction of the lake. I glanced out the window, catching a glimpse of the dark water. The lake lay still, its surface unnaturally smooth, reflecting the pale light of the moon. It looked almost lifeless, an expanse of inky black that seemed to swallow all light and sound. There was something about it that made my skin crawl, a sense of wrongness that I couldn't quite shake. I shook my head, trying to ignore it, but the melody grew louder, more insistent, until I found myself standing up, my feet moving almost as if they had a mind of their own. It was as if the sound was pulling me, dragging me towards the door, and I felt an overwhelming urge to step outside and find its source. I walked to the door, my hand reaching for the handle, when something caught my eye. A crumpled note, stuffed inside the lining of one of the cracked vinyl booth seats, the tear just big enough to hide it. The paper was creased, torn at the edges, and in scrawled handwriting, it read, "Do not, under any circumstances, go near the lake. If you see wet footprints leading from the lake to the diner, clean them immediately with hot water. If you hear scratching on the windows, keep your eyes on your work. The diner lights must remain dim but never off." I looked back at the door, the melody still calling to me, but I forced myself to step back, to sit down. I couldn't explain it, but something about the note felt true. The note was unsigned, but I felt a chill run down my spine as I read it. The old man hadn't mentioned any of this. As I looked at the stains, the smudges of dark red that could only be blood, I felt something twist inside me, saw a sense that this wasn't just some elaborate joke. As dawn broke, I saw the owner return, his hollow eyes glancing at me without a word. He looked more tired than before, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer than seemed necessary. He didn't ask if I'd heard anything, didn't seem to care how my shift went. I watched him for a moment, wondering what secrets lay behind those tired eyes, before returning to my car to try and get some sleep. Exhaustion weighed heavy on me, but sleep was elusive. When I finally dozed off, I dreamed I was drowning in the nearby lake, the dark water wrapping around me, pulling me under while the haunting melody echoed all around, muffled and relentless. I jolted awake, my heart pounding, the fear lingering even as I tried to shake it off. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. A few hours of uneasy rest before the next night began. I found an old, half-stale sandwich that tasted like cardboard, and washed it down with a cup of coffee so bitter it almost made me gag. I forced it down anyway, needing the energy. The next night was different. I was wiping down the counter, the old man gone home for the night, leaving me alone in the dimly lit diner. The air was thick, the oppressive silence broken only by the faint buzz of the flickering neon sign outside. It was almost 1 in the morning, and the road outside was empty. Nothing but darkness stretching into oblivion. The hum of the old refrigerator seemed to grow louder in the quiet, a low, unsettling drone that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. I could hear the occasional creak of the building settling, the soft rustle of something brushing against the outside walls, maybe the wind, or maybe something else. The air felt colder now, the chill creeping in, making me shiver. I decided to take a break from the unnerving quiet and clean the restrooms. I grabbed a rag and some cleaning supplies and made my way to the back. The restrooms were just as grimy as the rest of the diner. The tiles cracked and stained, the mirror above the sink coated in a layer of grime that made my reflection look ghostly. I scrubbed at the sink and wiped down the counters, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease that seemed to be pressing in on me. The sound of dripping water echoed off the walls, each drop seeming louder than the last. When I finally finished, I took a deep breath and made my way back to the front of the diner. But as soon as I stepped out of the restroom, my heart froze. There, on the floor, were wet footprints. I dropped the rag I was holding, the sound of it hitting the ground barely registering in my ears. The footprints led from the door, across the diner floor, and toward the counter where I stood. They were elongated, almost human but not quite, with webbed impressions that suggested something unnatural. My heart pounded as I backed away, my eyes tracing the eerie shape, each step seeming deliberate, as if whatever made them had been searching for me. I remembered the second rule true: clean them immediately with hot water. My heart pounded in my chest as I rushed to the back, my footsteps echoing through the empty diner. I fumbled with the bucket, my hands trembling as I turned on the tap, the hot water rushing out and steaming up in the cold air of the kitchen. Every second felt like an eternity, the feeling of something closing in on me growing stronger. I could almost sense eyes watching, waiting. I filled the bucket to the brim, the hot water scalding my hands as I picked it up, my grip shaky. As I hurried back to the front, my nerves got the best of me. I stumbled, the bucket slipping from my grip, hot water sloshing over the sides and splashing across the floor. Panic surged through me, my breath catching in my throat as I scrambled to pick it up. The scalding water burned my hands, but I barely felt the pain. My only focus was on those wet footprints. They were growing darker, spreading across the floor like an ink stain, each print more defined, more deliberate. It was as if whatever had made them was gaining strength, its presence becoming more real, more solid. I grabbed the rag, my hands trembling as I dipped into the bucket and began scrubbing at the prints. The hot water steamed as it hit the floor, the vapor rising around me like a fog. I swore I heard something hiss, low and menacing, like the sound of steam escaping from a valve. It was followed by a whisper, faint but unmistakable, as if something was speaking to me, taunting me. I scrubbed harder, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the fear clawing at my insides. The footprints slowly began to fade, the dark impressions dissolving under the hot water, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. My eyes darted to the windows, half expecting to see something staring back at me, but there was nothing, only darkness and my own reflection, pale and terrified. For a brief moment, I thought I saw movement in the reflection, a flicker of something shifting behind me. I spun around, my heart in my throat, but there was nothing there, only the empty diner, silent and still. I forced myself to breathe, to calm down, but the fear lingered, gnawing at me, refusing to let go. It was as if the darkness itself was alive, pressing in on me, waiting for me to slip up, to make a mistake. By the time I was done, the diner felt colder, the air heavy and oppressive, the silence almost deafening. I set the bucket down, my hands atching from the burns, and took a step back, staring at the floor. The footprints were gone, but the sense of unease remained, an invisible weight pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. Something wrong was going on here, and I knew this wasn't the last time I would see something like this. I glanced at the windows, half expecting to see something staring back at me, but there was nothing, just darkness and my own reflection, pale and frightened. For a brief moment, I thought I saw movement in the reflection, a flicker of something shifting behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing there. I forced myself to breathe, to calm down, but the fear lingered, gnawing at me. When the owner came in to begin his shift, I told him about the strange things that had been happening, the footprints, the whispers, the movement in the reflection. He listened with an expression that seemed almost indifferent, his eyes tired and hollow. When I finished, he let out a long sigh and shook his head. "You're just tired," he said dismissively, his voice flat. "Working nights can mess with your mind. You start imagining things, seeing things that aren't there." He gave me a half-hearted smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Get some rest. You'll feel better." But his response left me feeling uneasy, like he knew more than he was letting on. There was something in the way he spoke, the way he avoided my gaze, that made my skin crawl. But I nodded, forcing a smile, pretending to believe him. Deep down, I knew what I had experienced wasn't just in my head. Something was wrong with this place, and he knew it. I told him that I was only staying for this night, and expected to get paid tomorrow morning so I could leave. He gave me a strange look, then smirked, his eyes cold. "Sure, kid," he said, his voice dripping with something I couldn't quite place. "Tonight will be your last night." I tried to rest during the day, catching whatever sleep I could. It wasn't much, if someone could even call it sleep, but it was just enough to get me through the final night. The following night brought a darker, heavier atmosphere to the diner. Shadows pooled in every corner, stretching long across the floors, as if something unseen was lurking within them. I held my breath, the silence thick, waiting for the familiar yet dreadful sounds that had haunted my nights here. Suddenly, the jukebox crackled to life without warning, spilling out a warped, haunting melody that didn't belong in this world. The song was unrecognizable, distorted, echoed off the walls, grating against my mind like nails on a chalkboard. I rushed toward it, fingers fumbling over the buttons, desperate to shut it off. But the buttons wouldn't respond, as if they were locked in place. No matter what I did, the music only grew louder, more chaotic, each dissonant note stabbing through my head, making it impossible to think. It was as if the jukebox itself was alive, feeding off my fear. Then I heard it. It started soft, almost like a gentle brush against the glass. But I knew better. I knew it meant that something was out there, something dangerous, something that had found me and wasn't going to leave until it got what it wanted. The scraping grew louder, more insistent, and with each drag of a nail against the windowpane, I could feel the weight of something waiting. Rule 3 echoed in my mind. If you hear scratching on the windows, keep your eyes on your work. Swallowing hard, I forced myself to stare at the counter, at the dishes I was drying, moving my hands in a mindless rhythm to keep myself grounded. My pulse thundered in my ears, but I kept my gaze fixed, my fingers clutching the plates tightly as though they were my lifeline. The scratching continued, scraping deeper into the glass with each pass, filling the silence with a maddening rhythm. The jukebox went quiet just as abruptly as it had started, and the scratching stopped. The diner fell silent, but I knew the danger hadn't passed. I let out a slow, shaky breath, my heart still racing. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure stood by the window, tall and gaunt, with matted hair falling over a face that was half hidden in shadow, except for its eyes. Those eyes gleamed through the glass, piercing, like they could see straight through me. Its lips curved into a cruel smile, revealing teeth jagged and sharp, too sharp, as if they were meant to tear through something soft and fragile. My hands trembled as I clutched the counter, fighting the urge to look, to meet those eyes. But I could feel it calling me, its voice slithering into my mind like a twisted lullaby, a hum that carried with it the weight of everything I'd tried to escape. The creature knew me. It whispered my name, my secrets, my regrets, each word laced with venom, each syllable pulling me closer to the breaking point. Just as I felt myself slipping, the door burst open, slamming against the wall with a force that snapped me back to reality. The old man stood there, his eyes wild, his face twisted in terror. He looked at me, and in that moment I saw more fear in him than I had ever seen in anyone. His voice trembled as he spoke. "Sorry, kid," he whispered, his words thick with guilt. "You weren't supposed to make it this far." Before I could react, he strode toward the window, his hands shaking as he reached for the latch. My heart sank, fear twisting in my gut as I realized what was happening. He was letting it inside. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. True, why was he doing this? And what would happen if he succeeded? The sense of betrayal and desperation made my pulse quicken, and I felt utterly powerless, my feet glued to the floor as the horror unfolded in front of me. As the old man's trembling fingers fumbled with the latch, the creature's grin widened, its sharp teeth glinting, as though it could already taste what was to come. I took a step back, dread coiling in my gut, every fiber of my being screaming at me to run. But I couldn't move, my legs frozen in place as the man turned back to me, his face hollow and filled with a strange mix of desperation and surrender. "I didn't want this," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper, as if trying to convince himself more than me. "But I had no choice. It keeps her satisfied and it keeps me safe." He swallowed, his voice dropping to a ragged whisper. "But it's never enough." The horror of his words crashed over me. I was just one more in a long line of sacrifices, lured here to save his miserable life. The disgust was overwhelming, but there was no time to think. Behind him, the creature's fingers curled over the window frame, long and dripping with a dark, murky substance that trailed down the glass like ink. A rush of panic surged through me. I had to stop him, to prevent whatever horror was clawing its way into the diner. Desperate, I charged at the old man, my body colliding with his as I tried to stop him from opening the window. He grunted, his eyes flashing with a wild fury as he shoved me back. "You don't understand," he shouted, his voice cracking, filled with both fear and anger. He lunged at me, his hands outstretched, trying to pin me down for the creature that was now moving steadily towards us. We struggled, our bodies crashing into tables and chairs, the metal legs scraping loudly against the floor. His hands wrapped around my wrists, his strength surprising for someone who looked so frail. I could feel his nails digging into my skin, his breath hot and ragged against my face. My heart thundered in my chest as I glanced over his shoulder. The creature was inside now, its twisted form moving with a sickening fluidity, its pale skin glistening, its mouth stretched wide, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. With a surge of adrenaline, I twisted my body, managing to free one hand. My fingers scrambled across the counter until they closed around something cold and metallic, true, a kitchen knife. Without thinking, I plunged it into the old man's side. He let out a choked gasp, his grip loosening as his eyes widened in shock and pain. I pushed him away from me, his body stumbling backward, directly towards the creature. The creature's eyes gleamed with a predatory hunger as it reached out, its long, wet fingers wrapping around the old man's shoulders. He barely had time to scream before the creature sank its teeth into his neck, the sharp fangs tearing through flesh with a sickening crunch. His body went rigid, his eyes wide with terror as the creature dragged him down, its teeth still embedded in his neck. I could see the blood trailing behind them, dark and slick, leaving a gruesome path as it pulled him closer to the open window. His screams echoed through the diner, a desperate, haunting sound that sent shivers down my spine. His eyes locked onto mine one last time, filled with a pleading, terrified look, but there was nothing I could do. He was beyond saving. They reached the window, and with a final, jerking motion, the creature dragged him into the shadows outside. The old man's screams were cut off abruptly, leaving only the sound of the creature's rasping breath and the faint crunch of his body being pulled over the gravel outside. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My heart hammered as I listened to the horrible, wet sounds fading into the distance. Without looking back, I turned and ran, my footsteps pounding against the linoleum as I burst through the front door and into the cool night air. Outside, the world was still and silent, a stark contrast to the chaos I had left behind. The cold air bit into my skin, grounding me as I staggered forward, trying to shake the horrifying images from my mind. I kept walking, my steps unsteady, my heart still pounding. I started the car and floored it. I had survived, but I knew I would never be the same. Her whispers would always be there, a reminder of what I had faced, of the darkness that lurked just beyond the surface of the lake. My father told me the story of my family's generational curse. Well, I'm screwed. Let me start by saying that I never believed in curses, or the paranormal in general. To me, my family's tall tales were simply bullshit, and I'd make a point to roll my eyes every time they'd bring them up. They never really elaborated on what exactly these curses are, but would often speak about the fact that they exist. Even being 6 foot, 5 inches tall, my dad has always been a strange, secluded, quiet person. He kept to himself and would often leave for days, even weeks, at a time for work-related business. I called bullshit. He was a park ranger at a nearby national park. What would he need to be going out of town for in a position like that? No, I didn't think that my dad was cheating on my mom. That seemed highly unlikely, because every time he would leave on his trips, they'd always go down and have some kind of intense conversation alone in the basement. Many times I had tried to sneak in to hear even a whisper of what they spoke about, but I could never get close enough. By the time I was 19 and about to turn 20, I started noticing small differences. It was the little things, like the strange and worried looks that my mother would give me when she thought I was not looking. Then things got real weird when my father started constantly asking me to spend more time with him. The first few times he asked, I was so stunned that I stammered and didn't know exactly what to say. I told myself that he was trying to make up for lost time, and since I was his only child, he decided to up the intensity with each week that got closer to my 12th birthday. Was it a coincidence? Was he trying to give me the talk and just didn't know how to do it? That thought gave me gross chills. The man who'd been entirely too secretive about his life suddenly wanted to just open up and shoot the shit with me. I don't think so. I could see in his eyes that he had a yearning to tell me something. Maybe he wanted to explain what he was really doing all those times he would go out of town. Out of intense curiosity and a growing demand for answers, I quickly accepted when he asked me to come to his region of the park for a few days with him. Some guy time, as he called it. The second day at the park would be my 20th birthday, and I did not have many friends and like father, like son, so I decided to jump on the opportunity. Maybe being out in the great outdoors is exactly what I needed. Hell, maybe it'd even be good for me. As I packed my things and my camping equipment in my room, I turned and almost jumped out of my skin when I saw my mother literally standing inches away from my face. "Mom," I exclaimed, a heavy breath rushing out of my throat. "You scared the shit out of me." She tilted her head to the side. "I'm sorry, Ryan, I didn't mean to. I just wanted to see if you needed any help packing." Oh yeah, I needed to get out of here for a while. Things were getting next level weird. I looked around and then back at her. "I think I've got it covered, Mom. Thanks anyway." She backed up a bit, but still stared at me with that weird, almost questioning look on her face. I was beginning to get creeped out. "Is there anything else?" I asked, trying to be polite despite the deep uncomfortable feeling I had in the pit of my stomach. Her posture returned to normal, and she straightened her back. and smiled sweetly at me, not once taking her eyes off of mine. "I just wanted you to know that I love you, honey. That's all. I love you, no matter what, and I want you to always remember that." Now we were not a constant "I love you" or "be safe" kind of family. We weren't touchy-feely either, so when she embraced me in a big hug and rubbed my back, I felt entirely too awkward. I patted her back gently and attempted to offer a little bit of a hug back. "I love you too, Mom." We sat like that for what seemed like an eternity, until she finally released me and held me by my shoulders, looking deep into my eyes like the most proud parent on earth. She patted my shoulders once and then turned around and left the room. At this point, the thoughts that were going through my head were these: either my parents were getting divorced and my parents didn't know how to tell me directly, or my dad was going to sacrifice me to some wood. God, when we got to the park. "Oh, I'm DFIN Intel getting sacrificed," I thought. Did I really think that my own father was going to take me into the forest, extract my beating heart from my chest, and lie it before some old god from ages ago? No. But the way my parents were acting mere days away from my 20th birthday had me feeling all sorts of weird. The day that we were to leave for the trip was the day before my birthday. I woke up feeling great, and admittedly, a little excited for our trip. I've always loved camping and even aspired to be a park ranger like my dad one day. I got up and showered, put on my best hiking clothes, and walked out into the kitchen where my dad was already waiting. His eyes got wide and a big smile spread across his face. "You about ready, Ryan? You look just like a professional hiker today." I cracked a small smile. "Yeah, Dad, just need to get my things in the truck. I'm actually pretty excited." He smiled back at me, nodding, and then looked back at his newspaper. As we loaded into my dad's Ranger truck, my mom accompanied us outside to see us off. She hugged us both goodbye and told us she loved us. I watched her in the rearview mirror as we drove off, and I swear I saw her smiling and a tear roll down her cheek. Damn, I really am about to get sacrificed. A ways down the road, I turned my dad's music down and looked at him. He took quick glances between me and the road. "Everything okay, Ryan?" he asked with a questionable tone in his voice. "Dad," I began, "what the hell is going on? Why are we going on this trip? Why is Mom acting so weird? Why are you so suddenly interested in hanging out with me?" The words all jumbled together, and my dad turned his eyes back to the road. He sighed deeply. "Son, I know you feel like your mom and I are keeping some big secret from you, but it's not quite that simple." He shook his head, as if trying to find the words to say. I went to speak again, but he held up his hand as if he intended on finishing his sentence. "Well, we have always told you about curses and how deeply we believe in them, especially those that are generational, inherited by the children of those cursed." I sighed and put my head against the headrest. "Oh, here we go," I thought. I said nothing and let him continue. "We've talked about it so much for a reason, Ryan. Our family is a bit different." "Oh, you got that right, Dad," he continued. "Years and years ago, an ancestor of ours made a pact with a woman with unbelievable powers, son. These days you'd call her a witch." I was already getting a headache, and I rubbed my temples at the word witch. The pact was that the woman would provide crops, prosperity, and fertility to the man's family, and in return, he owed her his life. After all the good deeds were done by the witch, our ancestor decided that he wanted to live and thrive off of what the woman had done for him. That was not the deal, though, and when the woman came to collect her dues, he refused to give himself up to her. She was an angry, spiteful witch, more powerful than any who are around today. She told the man that he would pay, in blood, for generations to come. He stopped and looked at me, to see if I was still listening. I motioned for him to continue. She told the man that every firstborn child in the generations to come would be cursed. With what, the man didn't know. He spat at the witch and returned home to his wife. They did prosper, and eventually his wife bore a son. The years went by, and before the man knew it, his son was about to turn 20 years old. He was so proud of his son. I have to admit, my interest had peaked. I listened intently as he finished the story. The night before the man's son officially turned 20 years old, a tragedy occurred. The townspeople began to worry about the family after not having seen them in town for a few days. Some elders of the town decided to visit the home of the family, as they were concerned about their well-being. They came to the home, and to their horror, also came across a gory, disgusting, horrifying scene. The family had all been brutally slaughtered, except for the son, who was nowhere to be found. It was said that the bodies were mutilated so badly that they were unrecognizable. My head was spinning at this point. What the hell was going on? After that night, people would go missing near the family's now abandoned home. Brutal murder scenes and fear plagued the small town, but the son was never seen again. I couldn't catch the words before they came out of my mouth. So, what happened, Dad? He got quiet for a moment. It was the son of the man who had made the pact with the witch who had cursed the family. He brutally murdered an unknown number of people, but not in his right state of mind. At night, he would change. He took the partial look of a wolf mixed with a man and had no control over his actions. Instinct took over each and every time, and his instinct was simply to kill. A hunter who had set up near the abandoned home is the only one to have ever seen the boy and lived to tell the tale. The hunter claimed he saw a giant, muscular wolf that stood like a man. He spoke of eyes that glowed a bright orange, and teeth as sharp as knives. To this day, the hunter's legend still stands, although the townspeople have turned away from believing such unbelievable tales. Is my dad seriously talking about werewolves right now? I shook my head in disbelief. He stopped me before I had the chance to express my negative thoughts on this wild tale. I am one as well. That's where I go when I leave for days at a time. But son, over the years, our family has learned how to control the beast inside us. Think of it as a deer hunting trip without the guns. We no longer go insane and murder people after the first shift. I turned and looked at him with a surprised look. After the first shift? What the hell, Dad? At this point, I was almost sure that I was having some kind of fever dream. He had a solemn look on his face. The first transformation occurs on the night you turn 20. During that first time, you aren't in control of yourself. Instinct takes over. And son, he got serious and quieted his voice. Tonight, you will have your first transformation. This happened 5 years ago in Northern California, but I won't provide more details. Feel free to ask questions. My name is Sarah, and the night my friend Emily and I stumbled upon a terrifying cult in the woods was supposed to be a fun adventure. Emily's then boyfriend had recommended the forest to us, having hiked there before. I had just moved from my home country in Europe to the US 1 year earlier, because I met an American guy who had been studying in my country. Despite being an avid hiker and having explored trails in various parts of Europe and Asia, I never expected that this hike would turn into a nightmare. As a blonde girl with blue eyes, I've had my fair share of experiencing weird things and dangerous situations while hiking. But what we encountered that night was like something out of a Hollywood movie. None of us had ever been there before, but we had heard that it was beautiful and peaceful. As we hiked deeper into the woods, we began to notice strange symbols etched into the trees and rocks. The symbols appeared to be a mix of geometric shapes and abstract patterns. Some were simple lines and circles, while others were more complex and seemed to be intertwined with one another. Some of the symbols appeared to be repeating, while others were unique. As we hiked deeper into the woods, we saw more and more of these symbols etched into the landscape. They seemed to be guiding us towards the ritual site, as if they were marking the path to something important. It was an eerie feeling, as if we were trespassing in a sacred place that we didn't belong. I researched the meaning of the symbols later on, but it was difficult to say. They didn't seem to be connected to any specific religion or cult, but rather a product of some mystic or spiritual belief. It was as if they had been created by someone with a deep understanding of both geometry and mysticism. Looking back on it now, it's hard not to think about how strange those symbols were, and what kind of belief system they might have represented. It was clear that the people performing the ritual took them very seriously, and that they were an integral part of their practice. But for us, they were nothing more than mysterious etchings on the trees and rocks. At the time, we certainly noticed them and thought they were odd, but we didn't pay them much attention. We were too busy enjoying the beauty of nature around us, and the symbols seemed like just another part of the scenery. It wasn't until we heard the chanting that we realized something was wrong. Intrigued and curious, we followed the sound, hoping to see what was going on. But we certainly didn't expect to find a group of people dressed in black robes, performing a ritual around a large fire. It was like something straight out of a movie. The chanting grew louder and more intense, but we couldn't make out the words. The cultists, around 20 in number, were all clad in black robes, some with peculiar symbols painted on their faces, and others donning eerie masks. They encircled a towering bonfire, the flames leaping high into the night sky, casting a flickering orange glow across their sinister faces. In front of the fire stood an altar, adorned with flickering candles and other peculiar objects. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I watched in disbelief as one of the cultists produced a white rabbit and proceeded to sacrifice it on the altar. The chanting reached a fever pitch, and one of the cultists approached the fire with a small wooden box from within his robes. He opened it, revealing a vial containing an unknown substance, which he carefully dripped onto the flames. Suddenly, my eyes were drawn to a figure on a table near the altar. A woman, her body painted with intricate designs, lay still with her eyes closed, breathing gently as if in a deep slumber. The cultists around the fire were swaying in unison, holding candles aloft as if entranced by some dark magic. As the chanting grew louder still, the woman on the table began to stir. Her eyes fluttered open, and she sat up, looking around with a vacant expression. The cultists began to approach her, their faces twisted in ecstasy, as if they were under some kind of spell. All of a sudden, the woman let out a piercing scream and fell back onto the table, her body writhing in agony. The cultists dispersed, their faces now twisted in frustration and disappointment, as if the ritual had somehow failed. As they wandered around in confusion, one of them spotted us, and the rest of the cultists turned their attention towards us. They looked angry, as if they blamed us for interrupting their ceremony. I could feel their menacing stares as they began to approach us, their black robes billowing in the wind. We ran as fast as we could, but they were always right behind us. "I don't think we can outrun them," Emily gasped. "We need to find somewhere to hide." I nodded in agreement and scanned our surroundings frantically. That's when we spotted an old cabin up ahead. We ran inside and slammed the door shut, hoping it would hold. We could hear the cultists pounding on the door, and we knew it was only a matter of time before they broke through. We searched the cabin for any weapons we could find, and that's when we found an old axe. We knew it wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. We huddled together, ready to defend ourselves, when suddenly we heard yelling outside, followed by the sound of wolves howling close by. It was an eerie sound that sent chills down our spines. We didn't know if it was a good or bad sign, but at least the cultists had stopped pounding on the door. We were terrified, but we finally mustered the courage to peek outside. To our shock, the cultists were gone, and there was no sign of them. It was like they had vanished into thin air. We stayed in the cabin a few hours until we decided to make a run for it back to our car. We knew it was a risk, but we couldn't stay in the cabin forever. We opened the door cautiously, ready to bolt if we saw any sign of the cultists. We ran as fast as we could through the woods. We kept moving, trying to stay on the path we had taken earlier. We didn't know how long we had been running, but our legs were starting to feel like jelly. We kept running, the dense forest started to thin out, and we could see a clearing up ahead. Just as we thought we had made it, we saw them. Two cultists emerged from the tree line, their eyes fixated on us like predators. The sight of their black robes and masks made my blood run cold. They were holding long, sharp knives in their hands, glinting menacingly in the dappled sunlight. We skidded to a stop, our hearts racing in our chests. But just as they were about to close in on us, we heard a gunshot ring out. The cultist paused for a moment, startled, and we took the opportunity to run past them. As we looked back, we saw a figure emerge from a cabin up on a hill. The cabin was surrounded by a cleared radius of trees, presumably to prevent wildfires. The figure was dressed in a ranger's uniform, holding a gun in their hand. They shouted out a warning to the cultists, who seemed to think better of pursuing us any further. We kept running until we were sure we were out of danger. We collapsed on the ground, gasping for air and shaking with fear. We explained everything to the ranger, and he quickly called for backup. The police took our statements, and we led them back to the cabin where we had taken refuge. The officers searched the area, but they found no trace of the cultists. They told us that they would continue their investigation and that we should go home and stay safe. Emily and I got into our car, still trembling from the adrenaline and fear. We drove back to our homes, grateful to be alive but still shaken by what had happened. Over the next few days, we followed the news closely, hoping for any updates on the cult and their whereabouts. But there was no news, and the incident seemed to have been forgotten. Months passed, and Emily and I tried to move on from the terrifying experience. But every time we went into the woods or heard a strange noise, we couldn't help but remember that night. One day, we both received a letter in the mail. It was a handwritten note, with no return address. I opened it cautiously, unsure of what to expect. The letter read, "We know what you saw, and we know what you heard, but you should know that you are not safe. We are always watching, and we will come for you." Emily and I were terrified once again, and we immediately called the police. They assured us that they would investigate and take the letter as evidence material. However, we knew that the handwriting couldn't be recognized as belonging to any specific persons, since it appeared to be deliberately messy and inconsistent, almost as if the author had written it with their non-dominant hand. We hoped that the police would be able to catch the person responsible, but we knew that it would be difficult with such little evidence. We knew that we couldn't rely on the police alone. We started taking self-defense classes and installed security cameras around our homes. We never went into the woods again and always carried some form of protection with us. One becomes paranoid after such an experience, especially after receiving that letter. It felt like people were following me, strange individuals who just stood and stared. But whether it was just my imagination, I'm not sure. Years passed, and we never heard from the cult again, but we couldn't help but wonder if one or more of the cultists knew us. They must have obtained our addresses from somewhere, and it made us feel uneasy. After receiving multiple reports of strange noises and suspicious activity in the woods, the police and rangers collaborated to increase patrols in the area. This led to the arrest of 3 individuals who were suspected of being involved in illegal activities such as drug trafficking and animal cruelty. During the raid, the police found evidence of animal remains and drug paraphernalia, which confirmed their suspicions about the involvement of these individuals in criminal activities. They were charged with multiple offenses, including animal cruelty, drug trafficking, and conspiracy to commit illegal acts. Despite the best efforts of the police and other authorities, the investigation into the strange incidents in the woods and the incidents involving us continued for several months. However, the investigation was eventually closed, as they were unable to find any concrete evidence linking the arrested to these incidents. The strange incidents in the woods stopped, but the fact that most of the cultists were still free and at large left many questions unanswered and was unsettling. It was unclear if they had disbanded or if they were continuing their activities elsewhere. The police remained vigilant and continued to monitor the area, but there were no further reports of suspicious activity or strange occurrences. The incident remained a mystery, and the true intentions of the cultists and the full extent of their activities were unknown. It was a sobering reminder that there were still groups out there operating in secrecy, and that we may never know the full extent of their actions. From what was discovered, it appeared that the group was attempting to summon some sort of spiritual entity or deity using various objects such as candles, incense, and herbs. It was speculated that the cultists may have been practicing some form of neo-pagan or occult religion, though this was never confirmed. Some of the objects found at the site suggested a connection to ancient religions or mythologies, though it was unclear if these were authentic artifacts or simply replicas. Overall, the specifics of the ritual remained a mystery, as the arrested individuals denied any involvement and refused to divulge any information about their activities. Looking back, I still can't believe that I had never heard of the cult before. It's scary to think that such a dangerous group could be operating right under our noses without anyone knowing. As much as I wanted to forget that night, I couldn't help but feel grateful for the fortuitous events that allowed us to escape unharmed, despite the potential danger we faced that night. The thought of what might have happened if the cultists had managed to enter the cabin still sends shivers down my spine. And then the rangers showed up just in time to save us from the two others. If it weren't for these fortunate events, who knows what could have happened to us? It was as if fate had intervened to protect us from harm, or as some higher power was looking out for us that night. We later learned about superstitions surrounding the woods we were in, strange happenings and unusual occurrences in these parts. Some even believed that the forest was cursed and that those who entered were doomed to suffer misfortune. Perhaps the cultists themselves were aware of these superstitions and were afraid of what might happen if they continued their pursuit. Maybe they had some superstition around the cabin, or maybe they had encountered something even more terrifying than they had bargained for. Wolves don't normally attack people, let alone a group of 20 armed individuals. So why should the cultists be scared? As for the wolves, it's possible that their howling had some significance in the local folklore, and the cultists were wary of disturbing them. It's also possible that the wolves simply acted as a deterrent, scaring off the cultists with their pack mentality and aggressive behavior. Perhaps it was the sheer number of wolves that made the cultists back off, or maybe it was the unexpectedness of the situation. As for the yelling, it could have been a disagreement between the cultists themselves. The weird part is that the cultists didn't come back to the cabin. We waited anxiously for a while, wondering if they would return, but they never did. And then, the next day, we encountered two cultists in broad daylight. It didn't seem like they had been running, and they were coming from the opposite direction of where we had fled. We hadn't seen anyone following us, and we had run so fast that it seemed unlikely that they could have caught up to us. It was a strange and unsettling experience that left us with more questions than answers, and the mystery surrounding the events only added to the eerie atmosphere of the forest. But one thing was certain: we had survived an encounter that could have easily ended in tragedy, and for that we were fortunate. I don't hike anymore. The thought of being out in the woods and encountering the unknown was no longer thrilling, but terrifying. I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched, of being followed. What did the cultists want with us? Did someone know us? Was the letter only meant to scare us? Are we still in danger? These questions still haunt me to this day. As time passed, we went back to our normal lives, and eventually moved out of the area. That night in the woods was a wake-up call for me, a reminder to always stay vigilant, aware, and never underestimate the dangers that could be lurking. Who knows what other dangers are out there, waiting to be discovered. I will never tell my parents how my grandparents really died. They wouldn't believe me if I did. You may not either. About a month ago, I had just gotten out of class when I checked my phone. To my surprise, I had a voicemail from my father. Sure, Mom has called me from time to time since I left for college, but when I saw that my father had called me, I knew it had to be bad news. I just didn't know how bad. Son, we're buying you a plane ticket. You need to fly home tonight. There has been an accident. Call me when you get this. That's all the voicemail said. I called them and he explained that my grandfather had been killed in an accident with his combine while harvesting corn, and that the shock of finding him had given my grandmother a heart attack. The flight was nerve-wracking. I have never done well with small spaces, and I couldn't smoke on the flight, which made it even worse. I spent the whole flight fidgeting and walking back and forth to the restroom, even though I didn't need to go. I just needed to move around. My dad was already waiting for me when I landed, which ruined my plan of sneaking a cigarette before he showed. He gave me a hug and helped me load my bag in the car. I decided I needed a cigarette bad enough and lit one up in the parking garage. My dad had never seen me smoke, and I tried to act as casually as I could. He raised an eyebrow at me as he closed the trunk. I waited for a lecture or an outburst, but all he did was nod. "That's a nice lighter," he said. I hadn't realized I was still fidgeting with it. I handed him the vintage trench lighter. "Ellen, my girlfriend bought it for me a few weeks ago. Found it at an antique store in Seattle." He took it in his hand and looked it over approvingly. Then he handed it back. "No smoking in the car. Your mother would never let us hear the end of it," he instructed. My headache was gone now that I had a sufficient amount of nicotine. I threw the cigarette down and stomped it out with my foot. An hour later, we were back at my parents' house. My mother greeted me with a hug. Then she stepped back and looked me up and down. "Your father used to smoke menthols too when he was your age," she said, and gave my father a smirk. I wasn't sure if I was embarrassed she had caught me or surprised my dad used to smoke. He gave me a pat on the shoulder and walked into the house. We spent the night catching up on what I had been up to while I was in college. They filled me in on how their business was struggling, but they were keeping their head above water. And then eventually my dad filled me in on the details of the funeral. They had decided to do a closed casket on both of my grandparents. The injuries that my grandfather had received apparently were too gruesome for an open casket, and they did a closed casket on my grandmother's so that people would ask why. The next morning we attended the funeral. There were only a few people. My grandparents were in their 80s and had very few friends that were still around. Afterwards we went back to my parents' house and ate. "Son, your mom and I have talked about this. We need to sell your grandparents' farm. We have neither the time or money for the upkeep. If you can take a week off school and clean the place up, get it ready to sell, we will give you 25% of whatever we get when it sells." My father explained. I took a large bite of chicken and chewed it as I thought it over. I could call the school and explain the situation, and I could easily catch up later. "Yeah, I can do that." "But what do you mean clean it up? How bad is it?" I asked. My father and mother exchanged a worried look before she looked back down at her plate. "Just before your grandfather passed, your grandmother called me. She told me that he had been diagnosed with dementia. Between that and their diminished health, I suspect that the property is in pretty bad shape." "Ah. You haven't been out there?" I asked. "It wasn't more than a couple of hours away. I couldn't believe they hadn't been to visit." My mother replied in a defensive tone. We have both been working 7 days a week at the shop. We had to let all of our employees go. Business is not going too well. I nodded and asked what the plan was. I will drive you out tomorrow. You can stay there until I pick you up Friday. That gives you 6 days to get things boxed up. I already ordered the boxes. They will be delivered tomorrow. The following day, my father drove me up to the old farm. I spent a few weekends there as a kid. The place always had a creepy vibe, but it was fun. I could walk through the corn all day and never reach the end. As we pulled in, there was a large scarecrow that stood over the corn at the edge of the field. When did they get that thing? I asked. My dad didn't answer. Instead, he looked at it out of the corner of his eye. His face contorted into a look of intense worry, maybe fear. I couldn't tell. As we passed the scarecrow, I looked back. The wind hit it just right, and for a second, I would have sworn it turned its head to watch us. About 20 minutes after I had been dropped off, I was still wandering through the house, evaluating the countless knickknacks and pictures, trying to decide what should be kept, sold, or tossed. The phone rang. My heart skipped a beat. It had been so long since I had heard a landline ring, I thought it might be the fire alarm. I answered it. "This is Jim. I am delivering the boxes you ordered, but my GPS doesn't work out here. Can you give me directions?" The man asked. "Head down Old County Road about 5 miles. Make a right at the dirt road," I said. I tried to think of a landmark, knowing how vague that was. "You'll see a scarecrow. Make a right at the scarecrow." The man thanked me and hung up. About a half hour later, I was washing the dishes in the sink and cleaning up the kitchen. My grandmother must have just set out lunch before the accident, because there were 2 plates of food on the table. It was so rotten I couldn't tell what it was anymore. The pungent smell of mold and rotten food was making me gag, so I had to open the kitchen window. I listened to the wind chimes on the porch and found it rather relaxing. I began to wonder how many summer days my grandparents sat out on the porch, sipped sweet tea, and listened to the wind. Over the wind chimes, I heard a scream from the field. I shut off the water and leaned closer. I heard the scream again, almost as if someone was howling in pain. I rushed outside and stood at the edge of the corn. My grandfather had waited too long to harvest his crop. T-Sun had bleached the corn until it was now the color of bone. The stalks waved back and forth in the wind. The dry leaves rustled against each other as they swayed. I heard the noise again and began to walk out into the field toward the noise. "Hello?" I yelled. I passed row after row of maize, looking left and right in the 8 inches of space between rows. And then, in the distance, I saw a figure move. I began to run after it. I caught glimpses of the figure every few seconds as the wind allowed. After a while, I lost sight of it. I ran faster and faster, trying to catch up with whoever it was. And then I ran full speed into the scarecrow. The straw filling did little to dull the impact with the wood post it was mounted on. I fell back onto my back. I grabbed my nose and could feel the palm of my hand immediately filled with warm blood. I sat up and felt dizzy. My head throbbed with each beat of my heart. When I was finally able to stand up, I looked up at the scarecrow. It was probably 7 feet tall, and then another 2 feet off the ground. I was dressed in blue overalls and a red flannel. The head was a burlap bag with thick red string stitched into a jagged mouth and big black buttons sewn on for eyes. Then it was topped with a straw hat stitched on with the same red string used for the mouth. This thing was intimidating to me at 6'2". Those crows must be terrified of it, I thought to myself. I pinched my nose to stop the bleeding and began to look around. I saw the scarecrow when we pulled in. There was no way I made it to the road already. I tried to hop up to see over the corn. I couldn't see anything but more corn all the way to the horizon. And when my feet landed, my head felt like it was going to pop. Thick blood began to flow more quickly from my nose. I pinched my nose and held my head back, facing the sky to slow the bleeding. Out of the corner of my eye, that's when I saw it. The scarecrow had turned to face me. I turned to face the oversized doll and figured that it must have been the wind again. For a second we made eye contact. The big button eyes seemed to be looking right at me. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was the wind that moved the head. It was just a bag filled with straw. It was the wind that was blowing the stalks, and I imagined it was a figure running. It had even been the wind that was howling as it passed through the leaves. But still, as I stared at it, I knew it was staring back. The hair on my arms began to raise, making my arms tingle. My heart began to quicken. And then the scarecrow abruptly lifted its head back up and stared out over the field. I ran. I ran as fast as I could in the opposite direction. I stole short glances over my shoulder as I pushed through the corn. All I could see was a path of broken corn stalks behind me. Soon I heard a rumbling noise ahead of me. A truck, I thought. I kept pushing on. My lungs began to burn with the effort. My foot caught in a shallow irrigation ditch and sent me tumbling onto the dirt driveway. The driver of the truck locked up his brakes and skid past me, missing me by inches. I laid there in the dust for a moment. The driver got out of his truck. "What the fuck is wrong with you?" he asked. His tone was harsh and angry. I stood up to face him. He was in his mid-40s with a big beard and an even bigger beer belly. "I'm sorry, I lost my footing," I said. I looked back into the field, expecting to see the monster coming out any second. The man followed my gaze into the field and then looked back at me. "You high boy?" he asked seriously. I stopped myself. Telling him I was being chased by a scarecrow would only reinforce his accusation. "I hit my head pretty hard," I said, placing my hand back on my nose. He nodded and then offered to give me a ride back up to the house. "I would have been here earlier if you knew how to give directions. There wasn't no scarecrow at the road," he said. We pulled up to the house and began unloading the boxes he came to deliver. "I'll be back Friday to pick them up once they're full. Your dad booked a storage shed on the other side of town. You have about 200 square feet, so keep that in mind as you pack," the man said. He stared into the field. "My daddy has a cornfield in the next county. He didn't do half as well as they did here. Actually, now that I think about it, I drove past this place last year. I remember they had a rough crop last year. Do you know what they did differently this year?" The driver asked. "No, I'm sorry, I don't have any idea," I answered. He nodded and spit. "Well, take care of yourself. I'll see you on Friday." With that, he left. I went inside and grabbed a clean shirt. I washed the blood off of my face and hands in the bathroom and changed. I tried to shake off the incident with the scarecrow. I must be more stressed out with the loss of my grandparents than I realized. I needed a distraction and began to pack up the office downstairs. I was putting papers in a trash bag when I came across a letter my grandmother had written. "Son, I need some help with your father. The dementia is getting worse. The last 2 days he has been raving like a lunatic. This spring a man came by and offered us a scarecrow as a gift. He said it did wonders for his crop and wanted to pay it forward. Your father told him no at first, thinking the man was a swindler, but he insisted he didn't want anything in return. Anyway, your father is now convinced that the scarecrow is the reason we had such a great crop this year, but the scarecrow won't let him harvest it. I have left you several voicemails about this and you haven't called me back. So I thought I would write you. Please help. I am worried about your father." "Mom," I put the letter down and sat in the office chair. I could dismiss my experience with the scarecrow as stress or an overactive imagination. But my grandfather having similar worries about the same scarecrow. What are the odds? I thought to myself, I needed a cigarette. I went outside to the porch and lit one. I took a long drag and then exhaled. A cool breeze blew by, bringing the wind chimes to life. I turned around to look at them and see if one would be worth keeping. That's when I saw it. The scarecrow was now just 20 feet into the field. It hung on its post staring at me. While I was trying to process this, it fell down. more like hop down. Immediately the post went up and then disappeared into the field. It can't be alive, I thought to myself. Seconds later, the scarecrow came out of the corn. It began running across the lawn carrying the 10-foot post like a Trojan soldier running with a spear. The scarecrow launched the post. It sailed across the yard and missed me by a foot. It took down the wind chimes and impaled the wall behind me. I turned to run inside, but the post was now blocking my entrance. I hopped the rail on the porch and ran toward the old barn. I could hear the scarecrow running behind me, gaining on me, this straw rustling under his overalls and flannel. Once I was inside the barn, I tried to close the door, but it was stuck open from years of neglect. I grabbed the closest thing I could use as a weapon, a pitchfork. The scarecrow entered the room. Its jagged mouth and button eyes now seemed much more menacing as it marched toward me. I rammed the pitchfork into its chest as hard as I could. It pierced deep into its body easily, but it seemed to have no effect. With its left hand, or burlap mitten really, it grabbed my arm. The thing was impossibly strong. It used its right hand to pull the pitchfork out and then turn it toward me. I struggled uselessly against its grip. I desperately searched my pockets for something I could use as a weapon. I took my lighter out and flipped the top open. The flame caught almost instantly. In seconds, the scarecrow was fully engulfed. It let me go and fled into the field. The field was burned in less than an hour. The fire department said it was overly dry because it wasn't harvested on time. They didn't have any interest in investigating the matter further. My father saw the post stuck in the wall when he picked me up. I knew he recognized it as the scarecrow's post because he didn't ask any questions about how it got thrown through the wall or how the field burned down. I know, on some level, he suspects that the scarecrow killed his parents. I know on some level that he is grateful I killed it. But I know we will never discuss it because people would think we were crazy.